Welcome to MrWork.com. I'm your host Navjot Singh. In today's tutorial, I'm going to cover how to programmatically manipulate or pass URL parameters to an iframe using JavaScript. So the use cases of this could be you're embedding a page within your page and you may need to pass some parameters to the URL. And this is something just not like applicable for URL parameters. This is in general will help you on how you could actually change the source of the iframe programmatically using JavaScript. So let's straight away jump in. I'll start with the article here. So I'm going to provide a link to this article at the end of the video in the video description below. So first of all, I cover some basics, which is the optional section. In this, I just cover, so this is mostly for beginners who are not very used to JavaScript and HTML. So if you're used to these technologies, feel free to skip and straight away move to the solutions section, where I'll provide more details. So we cover what is JavaScript, an iframe, and a URL parameter. This is an important section, I think, which I'll also cover in the video. What is a query string? So in the example here, we can see this is a classic real world example. So this is basically from a Google search, where I search for Mr. Work in the search, and as you can see here in the browser URL bar, we can see the actual Google URL, and then there's a search, and we can see some parameters being passed within the query string. So let's first of all look at the red outline. So the whole red outline would signify the query string, and then we have three separate parameters, parameter 1, 2, and 3. So how to identify a query string? So a query string is a string included in the URL after a question mark. So here in the URL we can see a question mark. If I zoom that in, we can see a question mark here, and then it says client equals Firefox. And here's what this is doing. So basically this page is passing some information back to the Google server, telling it that, okay, this is browser is Firefox here, and then it passes a channel. Not sure what tthrow is, but it's definitely passing some information back to the server there, and it tells q equals Mr. Work, which is the actual search query here. And so this is like the query string, and client equals Firefox. This would be a parameter, and here client would be the key, and Firefox -b-d, this would be the value. So key value. So query string is basically a string passed in the URL in the form of parameters, so it can contain one or more parameters, whereas a parameter is just part of the query string, and it can have a key and a value. And then each parameter is separated by an ampersand or and sign. Again, in the below I provide more information, and then the solution part. So I'm still writing this article. You guys will have more information down below here, and let's go in and actually code the solution. So now we're gonna go in and programmatically basically pass in some parameters to the URL and change the URL. So here I have already created a HTML page, so it's blank, it doesn't show anything. Let's go into my code editor, which in this case is Visual Studio Code, where you can see it's a basic HTML template with a head, title, and a body. So first of all, we're gonna create an iframe. So that's what we're gonna be working with here, right? So I'm gonna create an iframe with an ID called my iframe. And that's it. We're gonna do that, and we're not gonna give it a source at this point. If we go back, we can see there's an iframe here. It's doing nothing at the moment. Let's go back, and now we're gonna write some script here, which is gonna be the JavaScript. This could actually be external file or something, but note that you need to, if you're manipulating your DOM and if you're changing the source of the iframe or passing in parameters, your script has to run after the iframe element has rendered on the page. So in this case, so we're going to have the script tags below the iframe tag, so outside the body tags. So I'm going to say let, so we could even use var, but let's use let. It's the more newer version of JavaScript. Let's say let my iframe equals document.get element by id, and we're gonna specify the id here, which is my iframe, which we specified up there. Sweet. So we have an iframe here to work with, and now we can say my iframe equal dot source. So this allows us to work and assign the source. So we're gonna give it a URL. Let's give it mrwork.com. Oh, I need to make that a string. Sweet. So this should actually work at this point, and we should see mrwork.com loading in the iframe, and here we go. So I mean, we're able to see that at the moment. We have an embedded example. Let me actually pull in a better example which we could actually use here and manipulate some things. So sweet. So this is a classic example. So I'm saying I'm passing in two parameters, which is geo and a size. Let's go into the view page. As we can see here I do the same. So this is a real world example. This solution actually works on my websites to serve house ads. So in here we can see I have an add iframe, and then we give it some margin, heights, and width. So we just do some styling and work with it. So let's actually take these stylings. This will just help us help make the iframe look a little bit better. And the next step is gonna be, I'm gonna be taking this URL this time instead of working with the mrwork.com URL. Let's specify, let's actually create another variable. Let's say let URL string equals. Okay, so we're gonna give that, and you can see we're not gonna pass these parameters here. We can just so here what I'm doing is just incorporating that solution here, and we can see how we're gonna pass those parameters. So as you can see, for this solution to work, we need these parameters, right? So if I was to pass 300 by 600, it would give me ad for a different size. So here we go, it's giving me an ad for different size. So in this case we want ad for 300 by 250 pixel. So if I remove this, this solution doesn't work, right? So we need to pass these parameters in, and we will be doing just that. And at this point we can say URL string. So let's go back in the browser and actually check out what happens at this point. Turn that off. Perfect. So we see a blank, and which is expected at this point. So now we go back into the step of how to pass the parameters to the iframe, right? So the solution is pretty simple in this case. What we're going to do is we're going to use this URL string, and what we can do is say you could either create another new string or you can just work with it. So let's first create height and width. So let's say width equals 300, height equals 250. So in this case, I'm giving static values. In your case, it could be dynamic values which you're getting from somewhere else. Doesn't really matter. We're just basically gonna pass them in here. So let's say let my URL, or let's say ads URL, since we're going to be serving an ad through this, we can say URL string plus, and as you know, for passing in a query string, we need to add a question mark that basically tells that, okay, this is a query string. And if we go back to the solution, we can see it accepts two parameters. One is geo and the other is size. So geo and size are the keys, and UK and 300 by 250 is the values. So we're going to say this, and so we basically have to get the same thing here. So we're going to say, okay, geo, then we can plus, oh, we need to create the geo as well. Let geo equals, in this case, UK, right? And we're gonna add this to ads URL. Close that. It's giving us an error at the moment. That's no problem. Now we're gonna give it geo. So the plus signs actually helps us add more strings to the existing string. So this was the actual string, then we added a string to it, and then we added our variable here, and then I'm gonna say, so we added the geo value, and the and symbol is used to separate the parameters. So and size equals, and I'm gonna say width plus, and we need to do the x plus height, right? And at this point we're pretty much done. We can even console it, console.log ads URL, and then again, as we did before, we basically access the iframe element by identifying it by element by ID method, and then basically specifying the source. And this is where we work with the query strings programmatically, and the solution should work. All right. As you can see, so this is what we were getting there. This is the solution that we are getting here at the moment now. This is the same. If we go back to console, we can see this is the URL that our final results created. Let's go back and let's change the size and see if it works. Let's try 728 by 90. And after this, we're going to progress to the actual solution, which is going to be covering passing the URL parameters. So we're going to cover how we will get the URL parameters first, and then we'll basically assign them to width, height, and geo. So that's why I covered the core basics, which is like we're progressing very slowly here. So we have done the constructing bit of the URL, and then we have these variables, and we're just going to fetch the URL parameters in the next step and actually show them. Let's first see the result of this query, and as we see, it changes as soon as these values are changed. From here, now what we're going to do is actually go in and try a couple of things. So from this time now, we're gonna start getting the URL string, the actual page URL. So we're gonna start fetching this URL programmatically, and then fetching the parameters through it. So whatever we pass in here next. So right now, when we pass in a parameter here, it doesn't really do anything. So if I say size equals 300 by 250, and we will not get creative of this size because we're not doing anything with this query string at the moment, but that's what we're gonna do. That's what I have implemented here. I'll show you a quick peek of how the solution looks like. So how it's gonna go is, so I'll provide more description, but I'm gonna give a quick overview. So how it's gonna work is we're gonna get the URL string, which will be the actual URL. In this case, this will be this index file, and then we're gonna use the URL object and pass the URL string, and then we're gonna have the geo, size, and other things we can just ignore at the moment, and we're going to use the search params.get method provided by most modern browsers. So it's this method is supported in all the browsers except Internet Explorer, which is pretty much legacy at this point. I have an alternate solution to that, but we will not cover that in this tutorial. Okay, fine. So let's go back and implement this. So instead of calling this URL string, I'm gonna rename this to endpoint, since this is our endpoint, and we're gonna use the URL string as differently. So let's call this endpoint. Sweet. And quickly go back and see if we're all good. Yeah, nice. So at this point we have our endpoint. I'm gonna go and say another URL string equals window dot location dot href. So this should give us the URL of the page, and let's console it as well. Console.log. Again, like I'm covering all the basics here, so you guys can have a good time implementing this. So this tutorial is aimed at everyone, not just like advanced people. So everyone can kind of learn here. So we're going to inspect element and see what the output is for that console statement. I'm going to refresh this. And as you can see, we have a new output here through the console. It's coming from line 16, which is, of course, this console statement, and it basically prints the same URL what we have here: file users mrwig.com desktop index.html, and then it provides us the geo and the size. That's what we wanted actually. And from here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna grab the geo and the size from this URL and gonna work with that, and that's gonna be our proper solution. So instead of width, height, and geo, let's first of all implement the geo. So we're gonna have to, let's go back for a second. First of all, we're gonna have to pass it through the URL object. I'm gonna have to quickly reference. Yeah, so it's gonna be URL equals new URL. And we're gonna pass in the URL string in there. Here we go. And at this point, since we're using the URL object, we now have access to the search parameters that we see here, and we're just gonna use those and get the geo and the size. So we're gonna go there. Actually, let me zoom it a bit. We're gonna say URL dot search params, and we're gonna get the geo. And let's create another one called size. Perfect, so we have basically implemented what we needed to. And yeah, of course, we're gonna add these there. Sweet. Let's actually print them out. Size. Sweet. Let's go back. URL.searchParams is not a function. Oh, sorry, I'm missing the .get. If we go back, perfect. So we're basically printing out the size and the geo, and from there what we're gonna do is we're gonna get the width and the height. Actually, we don't really have to do that since we already have the width over there, so we can basically remove these guys and say size. If I go back, perfect. So as we can see here, we have 300 by 250, and at this point we are able to access the URL parameters, and based upon that we're able to get a response from our ads page. So let me put in 728 by 90 here, and we should get an ad for that size. Perfect. Let me put in 300 by 600. Perfect. We're gonna get ads for that, as we can see. So it's a very simple process. Again, we started with the core basics, which are like creating an iframe with an ID, then identifying it, and then we basically move into the next phase, which is basically getting the geo and the size from the URL and then passing it to the iframe. And to get the URL parameters, the simple process is search params.get method, and if we go back, and we can check the documentation for that as well. I would recommend using Mozilla documentation for the URL search params, because these guys are the pioneers for this. Um, and then we can go in and see all the implementations for this. Here you can reference which method is supported by which browser. So for these URL search params.get method, this method is supported from Chrome 49 onwards, Edge 17 onwards, Firefox 29 onwards, and so forth. So that would be that, and then I have a video on this covering this specific example on YouTube. If you want to check that out, feel free. So this is my channel, and you're gonna find a lot of great content in here. So get URL parameter values from query string. This is the video where I cover all these concepts. There will be a link to a tutorial again. So I really hope this tutorial helped solve some of the issues for you and helped you. I think the video turned out to be quite long, but the main purpose was to cover every basic I possibly could. Thank you so much for watching, and please do subscribe to the channel.